Okay, so this lecture is basically about what has been happening in the last 9 months and stuff that we've talked about a little bit before, but really the notion is that America has an operating system that may need to be rebooted. So as some of you know, I have a blog, and about a year ago I wrote that I had a sense of dread that there was a profound economic peril. We have lived as a country off the rich inheritance of past generations, and now the party may be coming to a close. Last month, Nouriel Roubini, who is a professor at NYU, basically wrote that we now have a housing bubble, a mortgage bubble, an equity bubble, a bond bubble, a credit bubble, a commodity bubble, a private equity bubble, a hedge fund bubble, and it's all bursting at once. And that's essentially what happened here. Now, any of you who follow the stock market or have portfolios, I don't need to tell you that the last year has been one of the worst years in the history of the stock market. In fact, it is the worst year since 1932. But what is also bad and is masked by the official statistics of unemployment, which says that we have only 6.5% unemployment, is what is called the hidden unemployment. And that is people who are working part-time and would like to work full-time. And so when you total that up, the real unemployment rate is closer to 11%. Now, the conventional wisdom that is that the crash that we're suffering is all caused essentially by the housing bubble. But I want to say that I don't think that that is really true. And that this chart, which is a chart of household financial liabilities to disposable income, in other words, how much you earn compared to how much you owe, has in the last 50 years gotten completely out of whack. And that this is the basic problem that we suffer. In other words, that we have essentially gone from 40% to 160%. And that was unsustainable. So what will result now as we unwind that leverage is basically overcapacity. And we will find ourselves with empty malls and hollowed out factories. And that's the problem that we're going to have to confront over the next few years. Now, I talked about America 3.0, but first I need to give you an idea what I meant by America 1.0 and America 2.0. So America 1.0 is really the vision of Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the other part of this was George Washington's famous final speech, which said it will be our policy to cultivate tranquility at home and abroad and extend our commerce as far as possible. In other words, that this would be a country that was basically a commercial power, but not a military imperialistic power. That we would want to have tranquility everywhere, but at least do business with everyone. America 2.0 really took place when President Wilson decided that we should make the world safe for democracy. And this then changed our position with the rest of the world, and obviously that position became a much more military position in terms of our entrance into World War I, our entrance into World War II, and the successive wars that we have fought ever since then. And that really went from 1917 to 1980, at which point Ronald Reagan was elected, and I call this America 2.5 because this was essentially the conservative counter-revolution. And it had frontmen like Reagan, Rush Limbaugh, Newt Gingrich, but it also had intellectual progenitors like Irving Kristol, who basically said that the twin poles of neoconservatism that he had laid out were two. One, that in domestic affairs, the national government should shrink, by cutting taxes and business regulations, and in foreign affairs, the government should grow by becoming the world's sole military superpower. Now, this idea was backed by some very strong foundations in Washington, the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation, and the notion that this kind of discontinuity, where you would be cutting taxes radically, but growing a much bigger military, and that those two things might be in conflict, didn't seem to make any difference to the neoconservatives. Now, this, of course, has become, I would argue, part of our undoing. This philosophy reached its total progenitor in the Bush preemptive wars and tax cuts. The Quadrennial Defense Review called it the Long War, meaning that we would be in an unending war with terrorists. And as you can see by the chart, the people who were making more than 10 million took almost all of the tax cuts that were given by the Bush regime. This, needless to say, this combination of large military budgets and large tax cuts led to this incredible situation where the total credit market debt as a percentage of US GDP rose to heights that went beyond the heights that they were in 1929, just before the crash. And in fact, our total debt is above 44 trillion. So we are in an unprecedented situation, and in that sense, we reached a place where there was a break. Now, this break we've talked about before, which is really the ideas of Joseph Schumpeter, which is the idea of creative destruction. And we've seen creative destruction in companies. Certainly General Motors is undergoing that right now, but it also happens in countries where essentially you have inability to create new ideas and to innovate causes both companies and, in some ways, governments to fall. So this has led me to use the term interregnum, that we are in an interregnum, and Gramsci said, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, there arises a great diversity of morbid symptoms. And we are essentially experiencing some of these morbid symptoms right now. In other words, the old idea of neoconservative economics has failed us, but we do not yet have a way to figure out how to get out of it. Now, the term interregnum comes from the English Civil War, in which in 1649, Charles I had his head chopped off, and Cromwell began a 12-year rule that was the first parliamentary quasi-democracy in Great Britain, only to be ended when Charles II was restored to the throne. But I think of the interregnum in a much more metaphorical sense, and I would compare it to the end of the British Empire in 1901 when Queen Victoria died. This is her funeral train, and as you can notice, it is drawn by horses. There were no moving pictures of this event, and behind her carriage, bearing her body, are the crown princes of Europe. There were 3 emperors, 2 kings, 46 archdukes, and these people who basically ruled over Europe had more than half the world's citizens paying allegiance to them. In other words, the European feudal powers controlled a good part of the world, and needless to say, it was said that the sun never set on the English Empire. But at the very moment when this was happening, Marconi was raising the first wireless station in southern England that would send radio signals across the Atlantic. Albert Einstein was filing his first paper on the unified field theory. Freud was publishing his first book on the unconscious. Certainly the Wright brothers and Henry Ford were tinkering in their garages. So there was this unobserved technological revolution going on at the very time when the rulers of Europe thought that nothing could change. And so this, to me, was a true interregnum in the sense that the people who were walking behind Queen Victoria's casket had not a clue that this technological revolution was happening. So I have talked a little bit about this before, but we are in another revolution, and that revolution is basically whether the sources of leadership, innovation, and change will come from decentralized, networked, bottom-up forces or come from centralized, hierarchical, top-down forces. And this other axis of this chart says, will the global economic and cultural influence of the US decrease or increase? And given what you believe about this, it gives you 4 different pictures of what the world would look like in the next 20 years. And most of the futurists that I work with believe that at least we will be in the bottom half of this matrix. That the decentralized network bottom-up forces of companies like Google will dominate the centralized hierarchical top-down forces of companies like Microsoft. Now, I don't need to tell any of you who've spent time at the London School of Economics or anything else that empires always end. And if you spend time in London, you know that empires end, and this is needless to say, the final decadent end of the Roman Empire, and people study that all the time. But needless to say, the English Empire also ended. But I would argue that it ended in a way that was not uncomfortable for the English people, that they were able to go on in their lives and do quite well, and it didn't really matter. But those people who analyze empires and their end have come to the conclusion that there are basically 4 things that are signposts of the end of empire. One is called imperial overstretch, one is called cultural decline, one is accelerated inequality, and one is scientific regression. And I'll go through each of those. So